Hello everyone, welcome to Horror Stories. I know many of you enjoy listening to these videos to relax, relieve stress, or even fall asleep. I think it would be great if you could leave a comment and let me know where you're watching from around the world. And if you enjoy the content, don't forget to hit like and subscribe so you won't miss any other videos on the channel. Now, sit back, relax, and let's dive into today's story. You never really think it'll happen to your own family, you know? Hubert's voice was soft, almost distant, like he was still processing the events of that terrible day. You hear about these things happening to other people, on the news, in articles, but your own home, your own family? No, it doesn't seem possible. It just doesn't. He paused, staring down at his hands, which were clasped tightly together in his lap. The wind outside howled faintly, brushing against the window, adding a subtle, eerie tension to the room. The late autumn air felt cold, almost too cold for indoors, but no one was thinking about the chill. "I guess I should start from the beginning," he continued, his voice taking on a deeper, more reflective tone. "I think it started with Daman a few months ago. It wasn't obvious at first. He was always a quiet kid, kept to himself. But we all thought that was just him being introverted. He had his hobbies, spent a lot of time online, just like any other teenager, really." He stopped again, shaking his head as if trying to shake away the guilt, the questions that still haunted him. Looking back, I wish I had noticed the changes earlier, but it's hard to see things when you're so close, when you're living in the same house and just going through the motions of everyday life. But the signs, they were there. He started talking differently. He'd mentioned these strange ideas, philosophies he'd picked up online. At first, I didn't think much of it. Teenagers go through phases, right? But this wasn't just a phase. Something was changing in him. The room fell quiet again, the soft ticking of a clock somewhere in the background, the only sound cutting through the heavy silence. Daman had started following this group online, some kind of community. They talked about purity, higher truths, and things that, at the time, sounded like nonsense to me. But Damon was drawn to them. He became obsessed. He spent hours in his room, locked away, listening to them, reading their posts, joining their chats. It became his entire world, and we had no idea what he was getting into. I thought maybe he'd snap out of it eventually, but he didn't. His hands clenched tighter, knuckles turning white. He started distancing himself from us, his family, especially his mom. She'd try to talk to him, to pull him out of whatever rabbit hole he'd fallen into, but it was like he didn't hear her anymore. Like she wasn't his mother anymore. Just some obstacle to whatever he thought he was supposed to be doing. Hubert's voice wavered for the first time, and he quickly looked away, clearing his throat. I should have done something then. I should have seen what was happening. But I didn't. I didn't know. The day everything changed had started out so ordinary, so normal. Hubert had been at work. His wife Miriam was at home, as usual, with Desmond, their younger son, who had just come back from college for a break. The house was calm, peaceful. There was nothing out of the ordinary. Hubert remembers taking a call at work that morning, a regular check-in from Miriam. I didn't think anything of it. She sounded fine, told me Daman was in his room, as always, and Desmond was helping her in the kitchen. Just another day. His eyes darkened as he spoke, the pain evident. But then, a few hours later, my phone rang again. This time it was Desmond. The moment I answered, I knew something was wrong. Desmond wasn't making any sense. His voice was frantic, and I could hear this panic behind it. He kept saying something about Daman, about Mom, but I couldn't understand him. I tried to calm him down, tried to ask him to repeat what he was saying, but he just kept saying, "Dad, you need to come home. Something's wrong. Please, come home." Hubert's hands began to tremble slightly as he recounted the moment. I don't remember much of the drive back home. It's like my mind went blank, Like some part of me knew deep down that something terrible had happened, but I couldn't bring myself to face it. When he arrived at the house, the front door was open. I knew right then that whatever had happened was worse than I could have imagined. He swallowed hard, his voice strained. I ran inside, calling for Miriam, calling for Daman, but the house, it was too quiet. That's when I saw Desmond. He was sitting on the floor in the hallway, shaking, pale as a ghost. Desmond's eyes were wide with shock, his hands trembling as he pointed toward the living room. He didn't say a word. He didn't have to. When Hubert turned the corner, what he saw made his blood run cold. I found Miriam there, lying on the floor. He stopped, his breath catching in his throat. There was no time to process it. It was like everything crashed down on me at once. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. The details were still too painful for Hubert to recount fully. What he could say was that his family had been shattered in a way he couldn't have imagined. His wife was gone. The one who had always kept their family together, the one who had loved Daman more than anything in the world. And Daman, he wasn't there. He'd vanished, but it was clear. He was responsible. Hubert's voice grew quieter, more hollow as the weight of the realization set in. The police arrived soon after Desmond managed to call them, and they began searching for Daman. I couldn't process anything. I was in shock, disbelief, pain, everything at once. But what haunted me the most was, why? Why had Daman done this? What had led him so far down that path, and how could we have stopped it? Hubert shook his head again, as if still searching for answers that would never come. The truth is, we'll never fully know. Daman had become someone else, someone we didn't recognize, someone who had been influenced by people we'd never met, voices we'd never heard, all through a screen. He'd been pulled into a world we didn't understand, and by the time we realized it, it was too late. The room remained silent, the tension heavy and oppressive, as Hubert's eyes grew distant again. "If there's one thing I've learned from this," he said, his voice low and filled with sorrow, "it's that these things, these communities, these online groups, they prey on people who are vulnerable. They twist their minds, make them believe they're part of something bigger, something important. And by the time you realize what's happened, they've already taken over. They plant these ideas, these dangerous beliefs, and they fester, growing until they consume everything else. I just wish I had seen it before it got this far, before we lost everything." He paused, his shoulders sagging under the weight of his words. "I still don't know where Daman is. He's out there somewhere. Maybe he's hiding, or maybe he's still with them, wherever they are. But I do know one thing. The boy I raised, the son I loved, he's gone, and I don't know if we'll ever get him back." The wind howled louder outside, as if echoing the deep sense of loss in the room. Hubert stood up slowly, his movements heavy, and glanced toward the window. "Be careful," he said quietly, his voice tinged with the deepest kind of pain. "You think you know your family, your friends, the people around you. But the truth is, all it takes is one dark corner of the internet, one group, one voice, to turn everything upside down, and before you know it, they're gone." He turned and walked out of the room, leaving behind an empty silence, the weight of his words hanging in the air long after he had gone. "It started like any other evening," he began, his voice measured as if he were carefully choosing every word. "I was just walking home from work. The sun had already set, and it was one of those chilly, late fall evenings where you can see your breath in front of you. The streets were mostly empty, a little mist hanging in the air, and everything just felt quiet. Too quiet, now that I think about it." He paused, rubbing his hands together, more out of habit than cold, as if recalling the events still made him uneasy. "I usually take the same route home," he continued, "through this small park that cuts across a few blocks of the city. It's nothing special, just a path lined with trees, a couple of benches, and streetlights that flicker more often than they should. I like it because it's peaceful, a nice way to unwind after a long day. But that night, something was different. The park seemed darker than usual. The lights, dim and unreliable, cast long shadows that swayed with the wind, making the trees look like they were moving. The air was cold and sharp, biting at his skin. There was a stillness that hung in the air, something that he couldn't quite explain but felt deeply unsettling. "I didn't hear him at first," he said, shaking his head slightly as if he was frustrated with himself for not noticing. "But as I walked along the path, I suddenly became aware that I wasn't alone. You know that feeling when someone's watching you? When the hairs on the back of your neck stand up? That's what it felt like. And then, out of nowhere, this little voice spoke up behind me. "Excuse me, mister," the voice said, He stopped in his tracks, his heart skipping a beat. Slowly, he turned around and saw a small figure standing in the middle of the path, a child. The boy looked to be no older than 10, maybe 11, with messy dark hair and wearing a tattered, oversized coat that seemed too heavy for him. He stood there staring up at him, holding something in his hands. I remember thinking it was strange, he said, his voice now tinged with unease, that a kid would be out there alone, at that hour. It was past 8, and the park was empty. I looked around, but there was no one else in sight. Just me. And this boy. The boy didn't move closer. He just stood there, his dark eyes unblinking, almost as if he were waiting for something. And in his small, pale hands, he was clutching a piece of paper. "Can you help me?" the boy asked, his voice soft but clear in the stillness of the night. I didn't know what to say, he admitted, shifting uncomfortably. There was something about him that just felt off, but at the same time, he was just a kid, and I couldn't exactly ignore him. He forced a smile and took a small step forward, trying to keep his voice steady. "What's the matter? Are you lost?" he asked. The boy shook his head, still holding the piece of paper out in front of him. "I drew something," he said quietly. "I want to show it to you." That's when things started to feel really strange, he said, his hands gripping the arms of his chair a little tighter. I don't know why, but the way he said it, it was like a chill ran down my spine. I kept telling myself it was just a kid with a drawing, but something inside me was screaming to get out of there. I couldn't, though. Not yet. Not until I saw the drawing. Hesitant, but unable to resist the strange pull of curiosity, he stepped forward and took the piece of paper from the boy's outstretched hand. It was a rough sketch, drawn in dark, thick pencil strokes, the kind a child might make. But the image itself, it was of a man, he said slowly, his voice lowering. Or at least, I think it was supposed to be. The figure was tall and thin, but the details were all wrong. The man didn't have a face, just a blank oval where his features should have been. No eyes, no mouth, no nose, nothing. Just this eerie emptiness. And for some reason, it terrified me. He paused, taking a deep breath, as if trying to calm the tension that had risen within him. I tried to laugh it off, he continued, his voice tight. I tried to tell myself it was just a silly drawing from a kid with an overactive imagination, but the longer I stared at it, the more uncomfortable I became. It was like the figure in the drawing was staring back at me, even though it had no face. It didn't make sense, but that's how it felt. He looked down at the boy, forcing a smile despite the growing unease in his chest. "It's interesting," he said awkwardly, handing the paper back. "Did you draw this yourself?" The boy nodded, his expression unreadable. Then, without a word, he pointed to something behind him. "Look," the boy whispered. His heart skipped again, a cold sweat breaking out on his skin. Against his better judgment, he turned his head to follow the boy's gesture, and that's when he saw it. There, in the distance, near the edge of the park, I saw a figure. A tall, thin man standing beneath one of the flickering streetlights. Just standing there, not moving. And the thing that made my blood run cold was that he looked exactly like the figure in the drawing. Tall, thin, faceless, just standing there in the shadows. He swallowed hard, the memory sending a shiver down his spine. I don't know how long I stood there, staring at it, but it felt like an eternity. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. It couldn't be real. It couldn't be. He blinked, shaking his head, as if trying to snap himself out of the memory. I turned back to the boy, ready to ask him what was going on, but when I looked at him, that's when I saw it. The boy was no longer looking at him. Instead, his face had changed. It wasn't the same face anymore, he said, his voice dropping to a near whisper. His features, they were gone, just like in the drawing. His face was blank, completely featureless, like it had been erased. And he was just standing there staring at me with that empty face. A cold, suffocating silence filled the room as he spoke, the tension in his voice making everyone around him feel the same dread he had felt that night. I couldn't move, he continued, his voice trembling slightly. I wanted to run, I wanted to scream, but I couldn't do anything. I was frozen in place, staring at this boy, this thing that had no face, no eyes, nothing. And all the while, that figure in the distance was still there, watching, waiting. He took a deep breath, his hands shaking slightly as he remembered the suffocating fear that had gripped him. And then, just as suddenly as it started, it was over. His voice was quieter now, almost as if he were afraid to relive it. I blinked, and the boy was gone. The figure in the distance, gone. Just vanished. 1 second they were there, and the next, it was like they had never been. The park was empty again, completely still, and I was standing there, holding that drawing in my hand, my heart racing, trying to make sense of what had just happened. He paused, his expression tight, as if the memory was still too raw to fully process. "I didn't stay in that park for long after that," he said with a strained laugh, though there was no humor in it. "I walked home as fast as I could, constantly looking over my shoulder, expecting to see that faceless man standing there again, or that boy, just watching me from the shadows. But there was nothing. Nothing but the cold and the dark." He glanced down at his hands, his fingers lightly tracing the surface of the table in front of him, lost in thought. "I wish I could say that was the end of it," he admitted quietly. But it wasn't. His eyes darkened as he continued, his voice barely above a whisper now. "A few nights later, I found the drawing again. I don't know how, it was just there on my kitchen table, even though I was sure I had thrown it away. And ever since then I've had this feeling, this presence, always just out of sight. I'll see shadows move where they shouldn't, or I'll catch glimpses of something standing just at the edge of my vision. But when I look, there's nothing there. Just that same empty feeling, like I'm being watched." The wind outside picked up again, rattling the window, and for a moment the room felt colder, as if the temperature had dropped. "I don't know what that boy was or what he wanted," he finished, his voice filled with uncertainty and fear. "But I do know one thing. He wasn't just a kid. And that drawing, that faceless man, whatever it was, it's still out there. And I don't think it's done with me yet." You know, I'm not the kind of guy who gets scared easily. I've spent years driving trucks cross-country, going through all sorts of towns and meeting all kinds of people. You get used to the odd characters after a while. People in small towns who stare a little too long, or the guy at the gas station who talks too much. But this was different. This was something that I can't shake, something that still haunts me every time I stop for the night on the road. It happened about a year ago. I was driving late as usual, trying to push through another long haul. I don't remember exactly where I was, but it was somewhere in the Midwest. You know the kind of place. Flat, empty fields for miles, the occasional barn lit up by headlights, and not much else. The kind of drive where the road seems to stretch on forever, and you feel like you're the only person left on the planet. I had been driving for hours and needed a break, so when I saw the lights of a small diner flickering in the distance, I decided to pull over. It was one of those rundown places you only see in the middle of nowhere. The neon sign was half broken, the word diner buzzing dimly in the cold night air. There were no other cars in the lot, just mine, and I figured the place might be closed. But the open sign was glowing faintly in the window, so I decided to give it a shot. I walked in, and the bell above the door gave that familiar jingle. Inside, the place was nearly empty. The fluorescent lights flickered above, casting a sickly yellow glow over the vinyl booths and cracked linoleum floor. It smelled like old coffee and fried food that had been sitting too long on the grill. Behind the counter was a waitress, maybe in her 50s, with tired eyes and a name tag that read Doris. She gave me a half-hearted nod as I walked in, her gaze flicking up from a dog-eared magazine she was pretending to read. "Sit anywhere, Han," she said, her voice dull, like she'd been working this same shift for decades. I picked a booth by the window, the cold glass fogging slightly from the warmth inside. The diner was quiet, too quiet if you ask me. The kind of quiet where you start to notice the small noises, the hum of the refrigerator behind the counter, the soft hiss of the coffee machine, the distant buzz of the neon sign outside. It made my skin crawl, but I told myself it was just the exhaustion. I'd been on the road for hours, and my mind was playing tricks on me. Doris shuffled over to my table, her apron stained with grease. "What'll it be?" she asked, not bothering to look up from her notepad. "Just coffee," I replied, "and maybe some eggs, scrambled." She scribbled it down and walked back to the kitchen, her footsteps slow and deliberate. like she was trying not to wake someone. The bell on the door jingled again, and I glanced up, expecting to see some other late-night traveler wander in, but it wasn't. A man walked in. He was tall, lanky, and had this strange look about him. His clothes were dirty, like he'd been on the road for too long without a stop. His eyes were hollow, and there was something in the way he moved that made me uneasy. He didn't sit down right away. Instead, he stood just inside the door, his head cocked slightly to one side as if he was listening for something. And then he looked at me. I can't explain it, but the way he looked at me, it wasn't normal. His eyes locked onto mine, and I swear I could feel something cold settle in my chest. It was like he was sizing me up, studying me. I looked away quickly, trying to shake the feeling that he was watching me, but I could still feel his eyes on the back of my neck. I stared out the window, trying to focus on anything but him. The wind was picking up outside, blowing dust across the empty parking lot. The night felt darker, heavier, like the world outside the diner had shrunk to just this small patch of light. I could see the outline of my truck, its headlights reflecting dimly off the glass. Beyond that, nothing but shadows and the endless road. When I glanced back, the man had taken a seat at the counter. He was hunched over, staring at the empty space in front of him, as if waiting for something that wasn't coming. Doris didn't seem to notice him, or maybe she was just too tired to care. She poured his coffee in silence, and he didn't say a word. I tried to shake off the unease, telling myself it was nothing, just some drifter passing through like me. But then he did something that sent a shiver down my spine. As I sat there waiting for my food, he turned his head ever so slightly and looked at me again. His mouth curled into a slow, unsettling smile. It wasn't a friendly smile. It wasn't the kind of smile you give someone to say hello or how are you. It was something else, something darker. It felt like a challenge, like he knew something I didn't, like he was waiting for me to figure it out. I looked down at my hands, trying to ignore the pit of dread growing in my stomach. My mind raced. Was this guy following me? Did he know who I was? A million questions swirled through my head, none of them with answers. Doris came back with my coffee and eggs, and I thanked her quietly, trying to act normal, but my appetite was gone. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was very, very wrong. The man didn't eat. He just sat there, stirring his coffee slowly, methodically, his eyes never leaving me. Every time I glanced up, he was watching me, his strange, crooked smile plastered on his face. I couldn't take it anymore. I needed to get out of there. I reached for my wallet, tossing a few bills onto the table, and stood up. My legs felt heavy, my body stiff with tension. I forced myself to walk calmly to the door, even though every instinct was screaming at me to run. The bell jingled as I pushed the door open, and I stepped out into the cold night air. The wind had picked up, biting at my skin as I hurried across the parking lot toward my truck. I glanced back once, just for a second, and saw him standing in the doorway of the diner, watching me. His silhouette was dark against the pale glow of the diner's lights, but I could still see his eyes, still feel them. They followed me, boring into me, even as I fumbled with my keys and yanked the door of my truck open. I slammed the door shut, locking it in a single motion, my breath coming in short, ragged bursts. My hands were shaking as I jammed the key into the ignition, turning it so hard I thought it might break. The engine sputtered to life, and I peeled out of the parking lot, my tires kicking up dust as I sped back onto the empty highway. For a while, I drove in silence, my eyes flicking between the road and the rearview mirror. I half expected to see him following me, his shadowy figure walking down the road, always just a little too close for comfort. But there was nothing, just the empty stretch of road, disappearing into the horizon. I told myself it was over, that I was safe. But the farther I drove, the worse the feeling got. My chest was tight, my mind racing with the memory of that man's smile. That eerie, knowing smile that seemed to suggest he wasn't finished with me. The road ahead stretched out into the darkness, and I couldn't shake the feeling that he was still there, somewhere, waiting. And then I saw it. Up ahead, just beyond the reach of my headlights, there was something on the side of the road. At first I thought it was an animal, maybe a deer or some roadkill. But as I got closer, I realized what it was. My heart dropped into my stomach. It was a figure. standing in the middle of the road, and it was him. The same man from the diner, the same dirty clothes, the same hollow eyes, and that same twisted smile. He was standing there, motionless, his hands hanging limp at his sides, staring at me as I barreled toward him. I slammed on the brakes, the truck skidding to a stop just inches from where he stood. My hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white, my heart pounding in my chest. For a moment, we just stared at each other. Him, standing in the road with that sick smile on his face, and me, frozen in the driver's seat, too terrified to move. Then slowly, he lifted one hand and pointed directly at me. That was it. That was all I could take. I threw the truck into reverse, the tires screeching as I backed up, turning wildly onto the shoulder of the road. I didn't care where I was going, I just needed to get away. When I finally looked back in the rearview mirror, he was gone, vanished, like he had never been there at all. But I know what I saw. I know he was there, and I know he'll be back. Somewhere out there, he's still watching, still waiting. You know that feeling, the one where you walk into a room and everything seems just slightly off, like you can't quite put your finger on it, but something's wrong. Maybe it's a chair that's out of place or a window left open when you swear you'd closed it. It's subtle, almost trivial, but it lingers in the back of your mind, gnawing at you until you can't ignore it anymore. That's how it started for me. Except, it wasn't a chair or a window. It was a photograph. It was a quiet evening at home, one of those peaceful nights where the world outside feels far away. I had just finished dinner and was cleaning up when I decided to go through some old photo albums. It wasn't something I did often, maybe once or twice a year when nostalgia hit. My family had a tradition of taking a lot of pictures. Birthdays, holidays, even just random afternoons where nothing special was happening. My mom had always been the type to document everything, and I guess it rubbed off on me. The album I grabbed was an old one. The cover was worn, the pages thick with that faint smell of aging paper. I sat down in the living room, flipping through the first few pages. There were pictures of me as a kid, smiling awkwardly at birthday parties, Christmas mornings, and family vacations. You know the kind of pictures I mean, the ones that make you cringe at your old haircut or the clothes your parents made you wear. But then, as I kept flipping, something caught my eye. It was a photo of my family, me, my mom, my dad, and my little sister. We were all sitting together on the couch in our old living room. I remember that day clearly. It was my sister's 8th birthday. She had insisted on wearing this ridiculous princess crown, and I had been forced to sit next to her, grinning like an idiot while she blew out the candles on her cake. The picture was familiar, or at least it should have been. But something was wrong. There was a man in the background. He was standing behind us, just off to the side, half in the shadows. At first I didn't really notice him. My eyes were drawn to the familiar faces, my mom's smile, my sister's crown, my dad's hand resting on my shoulder. But then, as I looked closer, I saw him. He was tall, much taller than anyone in my family, with dark hair slicked back and wearing a suit that seemed oddly formal for the occasion. His face was expressionless, almost blurred, as if the camera hadn't quite focused on him. But it was his eyes, dark, piercing, staring straight ahead, that sent a chill down my spine. I didn't recognize him. I had no memory of anyone else being there that day. The more I looked at him, the more unsettled I felt. It was like he didn't belong in the picture, like he had somehow slipped in unnoticed, an intruder in a moment that should have been safe and familiar. I closed the album, suddenly feeling uneasy. My hands were shaking slightly, but I told myself I was being ridiculous. Maybe it was an old friend of my dad's or a neighbor who had stopped by. Maybe I just hadn't remembered him being there. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. I decided to leave it for the night, trying to shake the feeling that something was off. I went to bed, but I couldn't sleep. The image of that man kept flashing in my mind, the way he stood there, so still, so out of place. I tossed and turned, telling myself it was nothing, just a trick of the light, or maybe a glitch in my memory. The next morning, I couldn't stop thinking about the photo. It gnawed at me, this feeling that I had missed something important. So I went back to the album, flipping through the pages until I found the picture again. He was still there, Same dark suit, same expressionless face, same unnerving eyes. But now, something was different, something that made my heart race. He was closer. It wasn't by much, just a few inches maybe, but he was definitely standing closer to the couch than I remembered. His figure was clearer, more defined, and his eyes, they were looking directly at me. I slammed the album shut, my pulse racing. This wasn't possible. Pictures don't change. They're snapshots of a moment, frozen in time. They can't just shift like that. I took a deep breath, trying to calm myself down. There had to be an explanation. Maybe I hadn't noticed how close he was before, or maybe I was just imagining things. But no matter how hard I tried to rationalize it, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. For the rest of the day, I tried to distract myself, running errands, watching TV, anything to keep my mind off that photo. But every time I closed my eyes, I saw him, standing there, watching. That night, I couldn't resist. I had to check again. I pulled the album from the shelf and opened it to the same page. This time, he was standing right behind the couch. My breath caught in my throat. He was so close now, I could almost feel his presence looming over us. His face was clearer too. Pale, emotionless, but his eyes, they were burning into me, intense and cold, like he could see right through the picture and into me. It wasn't just that he was there. It felt like he was real, like he was aware of me. My mind raced. How was this possible? Was I losing my mind? I reached for my phone, scrolling through my contacts until I found my mom's number. I needed to talk to her, to ask if she remembered anything about that day, about the man in the picture. But as I stared at the screen, my thumb hovering over the call button, I hesitated. What if she didn't know? What if I was the only one who could see him? I shook my head, telling myself I was being paranoid. I pressed the call button and waited as the phone rang. After a few moments, my mom picked up. "Hey, sweetie, what's up?" she said, her voice cheerful as always. "Mom," I started, trying to keep my voice steady. "Do you remember Lisa's 8th birthday? The one where we took that picture on the couch?" There was a pause on the other end of the line. "Of course," she replied slowly. "Why?" I was looking at the photo, and there's a man in the background, tall, wearing a suit. "Do you remember him?" Another pause, longer this time. "A man? No, I don't remember anyone like that. It was just us that day." My heart sank. I knew it. I knew I hadn't imagined it. But before I could say anything else, my mom spoke again. "Are you okay? You sound off." I swallowed hard, forcing a smile even though she couldn't see me. "Yeah, I'm fine. Just curious. I'll talk to you later, okay?" After hanging up, I sat in silence, my mind racing. My mom didn't remember him. He shouldn't have been there, but he was, and he was getting closer. The next few days passed in a blur. I couldn't concentrate on anything. The image of that man haunted me, every waking moment filled with the dread of what I'd see next. Part of me wanted to burn the photo, destroy it so I'd never have to look at it again. But another part of me, some twisted, curious part, needed to know, needed to see how far he would go. So, against my better judgment, I opened the album again. This time, I wasn't prepared for what I saw. The man was no longer standing behind the couch. He was sitting in it, right next to me. My heart pounded in my chest as I stared at the picture. He was sitting on the edge of the cushion, his body turned slightly toward me, his cold eyes fixed on my face. His hand, God, I hadn't noticed it before, was resting on my shoulder, just barely touching the fabric of my shirt. I threw the album across the room, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps. This wasn't possible. It couldn't be happening. Pictures don't change like that. People don't just appear in them, but no matter how much I tried to deny it, I knew what I had seen. And then, the knock came. A soft, deliberate knock at the front door. I froze. My mind raced, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't want to answer it. I didn't want to know who or what was on the other side. But I had to. I stood up, my legs trembling, and walked slowly to the door. The knock came again, louder this time. I hesitated, my hand hovering over the doorknob. And then, with a deep breath, I opened it. The hallway was empty. But on the doorstep there was something, a photograph lying face down on the ground. With shaking hands, I picked it up and turned it over. It was the same photo, the same family picture from my sister's birthday. But this time, I wasn't in it. Instead, the man was sitting alone on the couch, smiling, his cold eyes staring straight ahead, and I knew I was next. I stared at the photo in disbelief, my mind struggling to process what I was seeing. The world around me seemed to blur, the hallway stretching and warping, making everything feel distant and unreal. My legs felt weak, and I had to brace myself against the doorframe just to keep from collapsing. How could this be happening? How could I be missing from the photo when just days ago I had been there, sitting right next to my sister, smiling, completely unaware that something dark was creeping into our lives? But now I wasn't there. The man was. And that smile, God, that twisted, hollow smile, was etched into his face like it was mocking me, as if he knew something I didn't, something I was terrified to learn. I stumbled back into the house, slamming the door behind me, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst out of my chest. The silence in the house felt suffocating, as if the walls were closing in around me, trapping me with the weight of my fear. I wanted to run, to get out, to leave everything behind and pretend none of this was real. But I couldn't. I needed answers. I needed to know who this man was, why he was appearing in my family's photos, why he was replacing me, and most importantly, what he wanted. My phone buzzed in my pocket, startling me. I fumbled to pull it out, hoping for a distraction, any distraction from the horror that was unfolding. It was a message from my mom. "Sweetie, are you okay? I've been thinking about that picture you mentioned. Something feels off. Call me when you can. Love you." I stared at the message, my fingers trembling over the screen. My mom didn't remember the man in the picture, but now she was feeling uneasy too. She knew something wasn't right. And if I told her about the new photo, the one where I had been erased, it would only make things worse. But I needed to talk to her. I needed to hear her voice, to feel some semblance of normalcy. Maybe she could help me figure this out. I dialed her number and pressed the phone to my ear. It rang once, twice, 3 times. I held my breath, waiting for her to pick up. Finally, she answered. "Hello? Mom, it's me," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "Are you all right?" she asked, her tone immediately filled with concern. "You sounded strange earlier. I've been worried." "I don't know," I admitted, sinking down onto the couch. My hands were shaking so badly that I could barely hold the phone. "There's something wrong with that photo. I don't know how to explain it, but there's a man in it, and now he's—" My voice cracked, and I couldn't finish the sentence. "He's what?" my mom asked, her voice tinged with fear. "He's sitting where I was, in the picture. He's taking my place." There was a long pause on the other end of the line, and for a moment I thought the call had dropped, but then my mom spoke again, her voice barely a whisper. "I've been seeing him too." A chill ran down my spine. "What? What do you mean?" "I've been going through old pictures too," she said, her voice trembling. I didn't want to say anything, because I thought I was just imagining it. But he's in them too, in every photo. Not just from your sister's birthday. I saw him in one from when you were little, in the background at your first day of school. He's always there, just standing in the distance, watching. I couldn't breathe. My chest felt tight, like the air had been sucked out of the room. My mom's words echoed in my mind, mixing with the image of that man's cold, empty eyes staring back at me from the photo. "He's been following us," she whispered, "for years." I shot up from the couch, pacing the room as panic surged through me. How could this be happening? How had we never noticed him before? And why was he only making himself known now? "What do we do?" I asked, desperation creeping into my voice. "I don't know," my mom said, her voice cracking. "I've tried looking him up, searching for any explanation, but I can't find anything. It's like he doesn't exist, like he's—" Suddenly, the call cut out. The line went dead, and the silence on the other end sent a wave of terror through me. "Mom," I called out, my voice shaking. "Mom, are you there?" Nothing. I tried calling her back, but the call wouldn't go through. It was as if her number had just vanished. My hands were trembling as I stood there in the middle of the living room, like staring at my phone in disbelief. This couldn't be real. This had to be some kind of nightmare. But no matter how hard I tried to convince myself, the cold fear gripping my chest told me otherwise. I glanced around the room, my eyes falling on the photo album still lying on the floor where I had thrown it earlier. Part of me didn't want to look at it again, didn't want to see if the man had moved, if he had gotten closer. But I had to know. With shaking hands, I picked up the album and opened it to the same page. The familiar scene greeted me. My family, the couch, the living room from years ago. And there, sitting in the spot where I had once been, was the man. His dark eyes were fixed on me, his expression colder, more sinister than before. But this time, something was different. He wasn't alone. There, standing beside him, was another figure, a woman. She had the same hollow, lifeless eyes as the man, and her hand rested on his shoulder in a way that sent a chill down my spine. I knew without a doubt who she was. It was my mom. Her face was blank, her features twisted into an expression I didn't recognize. She wasn't the warm, loving woman I had just spoken to on the phone. She was gone, just like me. And then, as I stared in horror, the man's mouth slowly curled into that same sickening smile. A knock echoed through the house. I froze. It was the same soft, deliberate knock that had come the night before, the one that had led me to find the photo on my doorstep. My heart pounded in my chest, and every instinct screamed at me to run, but my legs wouldn't move. The knock came again, louder this time. I forced myself to stand, my body trembling with fear. Step by step, I moved toward the door, each footfall feeling like I was walking toward something inevitable, something I couldn't escape. The third knock rang out, sharp and final. With trembling hands, I reached for the doorknob. My breath was ragged, my entire body on edge as I slowly twisted it open. The door creaked as it swung inward, and the cold night air rushed in, sending a shiver down my spine. Standing on the doorstep was the man. He didn't say a word. He didn't have to. Because behind him in the shadows I saw the others, and I knew I was next. I've always been the type to enjoy solitude, especially in the woods. There's something about being surrounded by nothing but trees and the occasional rustle of leaves that calms me. The isolation from the buzzing of life, the constant connection, it's like a detox for the soul. That's why I decided to go camping last fall, just before the cold really set in. It was supposed to be one last getaway before winter, a chance to unplug and clear my mind. I picked a spot way out in the national forest, well off the beaten path. No campsites, no picnic tables, no other people. Just me, my tent, and nature. I hiked about 8 miles in that day, found a small clearing surrounded by towering pines and set up camp. By evening, I had a fire going and everything was peaceful, just like I'd hoped. The sky was clear and the moon was just starting to rise, casting a soft silver light over the forest. The stillness was comforting at first. It's funny how, in the beginning, silence in the woods feels almost like a blanket. It wraps you up in calm, helps you breathe deeper, makes the stars seem brighter. But that same silence, that stillness, can turn on you. It's like it shifts without you noticing until it becomes something else entirely. It's not comforting anymore. It's oppressive. I didn't know that feeling yet. Not when I crawled into my tent that night, zipped myself into my sleeping bag, and listened to the crackling remnants of my fire. I drifted off pretty quickly, content with the day and looking forward to another long hike in the morning. But then something woke me up. At first, I didn't really know what it was. I figured it was just the wind, or maybe an animal moving through the brush nearby. It was deep into the night now, colder. My fire had died down completely, leaving only a faint glow of embers through the tent fabric. I lay there, blinking in the darkness, trying to figure out why I was awake. My body was tense, and my heart was pounding a little too fast for someone who'd just woken up from a deep sleep. That's when I heard it again, a noise outside the tent. It wasn't loud, more like a soft shuffling sound, something brushing against the leaves. At first, I thought it could have been a raccoon, or maybe a deer moving through the woods. Animals were normal out here, but this didn't feel normal. There was something deliberate about the sound, something too steady, like it wasn't just a random animal passing by. It was closer, too close. I propped myself up on one elbow, my pulse quickening as I listened more intently. The air in the tent felt colder now, and my breath came out in shallow puffs. I didn't dare move too much. I felt like I needed to stay still, like making noise would give me away. Then there it was again, this time closer. A faint but unmistakable scratch against the fabric of the tent. I froze. Now, I don't get scared easily. I've camped alone dozens of times, and I've seen my fair share of weird stuff in the woods. But this this was different. The sound wasn't an animal. It couldn't be. It was too slow, too deliberate. It was like someone or something was outside, dragging their fingers along the outside of my tent. My mind raced through possibilities. Maybe it was a branch or some stray debris that had fallen against the tent. But the trees weren't close enough for that, and there wasn't any wind. And this sound, it was soft, but it was there. It wasn't random. I reached slowly for my flashlight, trying not to make any noise. My fingers found it in the darkness, cold and reassuring. I gripped it tightly, debating whether I should turn it on. Part of me didn't want to see what might be out there. But the other part of me needed to know, needed to face whatever was making that sound. With a deep breath, I clicked the flashlight on. The beam cut through the darkness inside the tent, casting sharp shadows against the fabric walls. I aimed it toward the spot where I'd heard the noise, the light barely illuminating the shape of the tent's inner walls. Everything was still. For a second, I wondered if I'd imagined it. But then, right in front of me, I saw the faintest movement, a subtle ripple in the fabric of the tent, like something brushing against it. My heart slammed against my ribs, and I sat up fully, every nerve in my body on edge. I had to make a decision. I could sit there, paralyzed, hoping the noise would just go away. Or I could go outside and see for myself. The thought of unzipping the tent, of stepping out into the cold night and facing whatever might be out there, sent a jolt of fear through me. But I couldn't just stay there, trapped inside my own fear. I needed to know. Slowly, carefully, I reached for the zipper of the tent. The sound of it opening felt unnaturally loud in the quiet of the night, each tooth of the zipper clicking open like a countdown. The cold air rushed in as I pulled the flap open, and I hesitated for a moment, flashlight in hand, before sticking my head out into the night. The forest was still. The moon had risen higher now, casting an eerie light over the clearing. The trees loomed like silent sentinels, their branches casting long, twisted shadows over the ground. The wind was completely still. Not a single leaf moved. I scanned the perimeter of my campsite with the flashlight, the beam cutting through the darkness, but there was nothing. No sign of anyone, or anything. I stepped out of the tent, my breath visible in the chilly air, and stood there, listening. My heart was still racing, my skin tingling with unease, but the sound was gone. Everything was quiet again, as if whatever had been there had disappeared the moment I turned the flashlight on. Maybe it really had just been an animal. Maybe I was overreacting. But then, just as I was about to turn back toward the tent, I heard it again. This time it wasn't a soft scratch. It was a low, deliberate footstep, crunching on the leaves just beyond the edge of the clearing. I swung the flashlight in the direction of the sound, my hands trembling. The beam of light swept over the trees, the underbrush, but I couldn't see anything. I took a step forward, straining to hear, to catch a glimpse of movement. Another footstep. This time closer. I could feel the hair on the back of my neck standing up. Someone was out there, watching, waiting. I could feel their presence, but I couldn't see them. The air felt heavier now, thick with tension. Every instinct in my body was screaming at me to get back into the tent, to hide, to do something. I called out, my voice shaky. "Hello? Is someone there?" No answer. The silence that followed was worse than any response I could have gotten. It was thick, suffocating, like the night itself was holding its breath, waiting to see what I would do next. My heart pounded in my ears, and my mind raced with questions. Who was out there? Why were they hiding? Was this some sick joke, or was I in real danger? I backed up slowly, keeping the flashlight aimed at the trees, but I couldn't see anything beyond the thick shadows. Suddenly, the footsteps picked up again, faster now, moving through the trees at a pace that was no longer cautious. It was like whoever, or whatever, was out there had decided they didn't need to hide anymore. I turned and bolted back to the tent, diving inside and zipping it shut with shaking hands. I grabbed my pack, rummaging frantically for anything I could use as a weapon. A knife, a heavy flashlight, anything to defend myself if it came to that. The footsteps stopped right outside the tent. I froze, my breath shallow and ragged. I could hear something, or someone, just inches away from the thin fabric walls, standing there in the darkness. My flashlight flickered slightly, the battery starting to die, casting the inside of the tent in a dull, eerie glow. The silence stretched on. My heart was beating so hard I thought it might give me away. I gripped the flashlight tighter, every muscle in my body tensed, waiting for whatever was out there to make its move. And then slowly, I heard it. A soft, deliberate sound, a low, raspy breathing coming from right outside the tent. It was slow and even, like whoever was out there was just standing still, watching me, listening. I didn't dare move. My mind was racing, trying to figure out what to do. Should I unzip the tent and confront whoever was out there? Or should I wait, hope they'd go away? But before I could decide, something pressed against the fabric of the tent. A hand. I could see the outline of fingers, long and thin, pressing against the material, slowly dragging down the side of the tent in a motion that made my skin crawl. It was deliberate, intentional, as if whoever was out there wanted me to know they were there, wanted me to feel their presence. I stifled a gasp, my pulse roaring in my ears. And then, just as quickly as it had appeared, the hand disappeared. The breathing stopped. Silence. I sat there, gripping the flashlight so tightly my knuckles turned white, waiting for the next sound, the next sign of movement. But nothing happened. Minutes passed, maybe hours. I lost track of time, my body frozen in fear, my mind on high alert. I couldn't hear anything now. No footsteps, no breathing. The only sound was the faint rustle of leaves as the wind finally picked up again. I stayed like that for what felt like forever, waiting for something, anything to happen. But the longer I waited, the more I began to wonder if maybe, just maybe, whoever had been out there was gone. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, I gathered the courage to move. I reached out slowly, unzipping the tent just enough to peek outside. The clearing was empty. No one was there. I stepped out, my heart still racing, and shone the flashlight around the campsite. Everything was as I'd left it. No signs of a struggle, no footprints, no indication that anyone had been there at all. But I knew what I'd heard. I knew what I'd felt. And as I stood there, staring into the dark expanse of the forest, I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever or whoever had been outside my tent that night wasn't just passing through. They had been watching me, and they weren't finished yet. You know, I used to think my neighborhood was one of the safest places in the world. It's quiet, almost too quiet sometimes. The kind of place where you hear dogs barking in the distance or a car passing by every now and then, but mostly it's just still. It's one of those suburban areas where nothing exciting ever happens and people like it that way. At least I did until last Tuesday night. It started out as an ordinary evening. I'd been working late as usual. My home office has this small window that overlooks the street. I often look out of it when I'm thinking or stuck on a problem at work. That night was no different. It was around 11 p.m., maybe a little later, and I was finishing up some paperwork. The house was dark except for the lamp at my desk, casting a soft glow over my workspace. Outside it was cold, with that crisp autumn air, and the wind had been howling for most of the evening. You know how wind sounds in the dead of night? It almost feels alive, like it's searching for something. I remember feeling a bit uneasy for no reason at all. That kind of irrational anxiety that creeps up when you're tired and your imagination starts running wild. I brushed it off, blaming it on my workload, and went to get myself a glass of water. I walked into the kitchen, and that's when I saw it. Out of the corner of my eye, I noticed movement outside. I froze, my hand still on the kitchen counter. You know how it is. Sometimes you're not sure if you actually saw something or if your mind's playing tricks on you. But then I looked again. There was a man, standing under the street lamp across the road, just staring. At first I thought maybe he was a neighbor or someone waiting for a ride, but no, he wasn't doing anything. He just stood there, completely still, facing my house. It was unsettling, but I tried to convince myself it was nothing. I mean, it's not illegal to stand on the street, right? Maybe he was just lost, or drunk. I turned away, pretending not to care, but I couldn't shake the feeling. The hairs on the back of my neck were standing up. Something wasn't right. I forced myself to continue with my routine, got my glass of water, turned off the lights, and went to my bedroom. I told myself he'd be gone by the time I went to bed, and I didn't need to check. But my nerves were getting the best of me. My bedroom has a bigger window, and as I passed by it, I couldn't help but take a quick glance outside. He was still there, but this time, he was closer. He had moved from the street lamp to the sidewalk directly in front of my house. My heart was pounding now, and I don't know if it was the cold air or my anxiety, but I felt this sudden chill sweep over me. My first instinct was to grab my phone, but I didn't want to seem paranoid. I mean, what would I even say to the police? "Hi, there's a guy standing on the street near my house." That sounded ridiculous, even in my own head. I tried to shake it off, and I crawled into bed, leaving the blinds slightly open. My logic was, if I kept an eye on him, I'd feel better. The room was dark, except for the pale light from the street lamp outside, which seemed to cast these long, unsettling shadows across the floor. I lay there for what felt like hours, listening to the wind rattle the windows. I kept telling myself that he would leave, that maybe he was just waiting for someone. But then came the sound. A soft, scraping noise like metal against glass. At first I thought it was the wind. It had been pretty loud all night after all. But no, this was different. It was deliberate. I sat up in bed, my heart now racing. The sound came again, this time louder. It was coming from the window, my window. I slowly slid out of bed, my legs feeling like they were made of lead, and tiptoed toward the noise. I reached the window and peeked through the small gap in the blinds. There he was. The man was standing right at my window, his face inches from the glass. He was staring straight at me, and then I saw his hand. He had something in it, something metal, and he was dragging it along the edge of the window frame. A shiver ran down my spine as I realized he was trying to break in. For a moment I was completely frozen. I didn't know what to do. My mind was racing with thoughts. Should I scream? Should I call the police? Should I run? But before I could make a decision, the noise stopped. The man's hand dropped, and he just walked away. I stood there, staring at the now empty space outside my window, my heart still pounding in my chest. Had he given up? I wasn't sure what had just happened. My instincts told me to lock everything, to make sure the doors and windows were secure. I rushed through the house, double-checking every lock, and that's when I saw it, the back door. The lock was broken. The deadbolt had been forced open, and there were fresh marks on the wood. My stomach dropped. He had been trying to get in through the back. My hands were shaking as I called 911. The operator tried to keep me calm, but all I could think about was that man. Where had he gone? Why had he suddenly stopped? I kept picturing his face, those cold, empty eyes staring at me through the glass. The police arrived within minutes, but by then, the man was long gone. They searched the area, but there was no sign of him. No footprints, no clue as to who he was or why he had been there. The only thing they found was the damage to my door and window. That night, I barely slept. Every sound made me jump. Every creak of the house sent my heart racing. Even the wind outside felt more sinister, like it was carrying whispers of something I didn't want to hear. I kept replaying everything in my head, trying to make sense of it. But the more I thought about it, the less it made sense. I stood up and walked to the front door, my heart already pounding. I was half expecting to see something out of place, but everything seemed normal. That's when I noticed the envelope. It had been slipped through the mail slot, lying on the floor. I picked it up, my hands shaking as I tore it open. Inside was a single sheet of paper, with one sentence written in neat, precise handwriting. "I'll be back when you least expect it." My blood ran cold. I dropped the letter and backed away from the door, my mind racing. I haven't seen him since, but I know he's out there, watching, waiting. And now, every night, I lie in bed, listening to the wind and wondering if tonight will be the night he comes back. And the worst part? I have no idea why he chose me, or what he's planning next. You ever have a memory from your childhood that sticks with you, no matter how hard you try to shake it? Something that, even years later, makes your skin crawl when you think about it? Well, I've got one. I don't talk about it often because, honestly, I'm still trying to make sense of it myself. But whenever someone mentions the woods, or hunting, or even dead animals, I'm immediately pulled back to that one night in the Idaho wilderness. I was about 12 years old at the time, living with my family in a small town in northern Idaho. The kind of town where everybody knows everybody and life is simple. My dad had this old Chevy truck, a real clunker, but reliable as hell. Every fall, he'd take us out into the woods to collect firewood for the winter. It was something we did as a family, me, my dad, and sometimes my older sister if she wasn't too busy with school or friends. Mom stayed home most times, claiming she hated the cold, but I think she just didn't like traipsing through the forest. Anyway, this one particular evening, it was late November, maybe a week or so before Thanksgiving, we were heading out to our usual spot in the woods, a few miles outside of town. My dad knew these forests like the back of his hand, and he'd always remind me how safe it was out there. Nothing to worry about in these woods except for the cold, son, he'd say, grinning as if he was trying to convince himself as much as me. I didn't mind it so much, though. I liked the quiet, the way the trees loomed overhead like they were watching you, but in a way that felt almost comforting. Back then, I found it peaceful. But that evening, something was different. I remember it was colder than usual. The kind of cold that sinks into your bones and refuses to leave, even after you've layered up with every jacket and sweater you own. The sun was dipping below the horizon, and the sky had this grayish-pink hue, the kind you get just before darkness swallows the day. The wind was picking up, rustling the branches and making this eerie whistling sound through the trees. And the woods, God, they felt still. Too still. It was like the whole forest was holding its breath. We'd been driving for about 20 minutes when I saw it, a deer, standing right in the middle of the road. Now, seeing deer in Idaho is nothing unusual. In fact, you have to be careful when driving through the woods because they'll often dart out in front of you. But this one was different. The way it was standing there, staring at us, its eyes didn't reflect the headlights the way they usually do. They were just dark, hollow almost. "Dad, look," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. My dad slowed the truck to a crawl, squinting through the windshield. "Yeah, I see it," he muttered, more to himself than to me. The thing is, this deer wasn't moving. It wasn't startled or scared, which is odd because deer usually run the moment they sense danger. This one just stood there, frozen, as if it was waiting for something. Its body was stiff, unnatural, like it was holding itself up with some invisible strings. And that's when I noticed something even stranger. Its skin. It looked wrong. There were patches of fur missing, exposing pale, decayed flesh underneath. It was like the thing had been dead for weeks, yet here it was, standing in the middle of the road, looking very much alive. My dad let out a low curse under his breath. "What the hell?" He tapped the horn, just a quick honk to scare it off, but the deer didn't flinch. It didn't even blink. It just stood there, staring at us with those empty eyes. And then, in one jerky motion, it took a step toward the truck. I felt my stomach drop. "Dad," I said, gripping the seatbelt across my chest. Without a word, my dad revved the engine. The truck lurched forward just enough to make the deer move, but it didn't run off the way I expected it to. No, it turned. And as it did, I saw something that made my blood run cold. The back half of its body was gone. Well, not gone exactly, but mangled, like it had been chewed up by something. Its back legs were twisted, broken, and there was this long gash running down its side, exposing ribs and raw muscle. And yet, it was walking, moving as if nothing was wrong. My dad didn't say anything for a few seconds, but I could see his knuckles turning white on the steering wheel. He wasn't the type to get scared easily, but I could tell this was rattling him. Without another word, he slammed his foot on the gas, and the truck shot forward, swerving around the deer. As we passed it, I turned in my seat to get one last look, and I swear to God, it was watching us go. Its head had twisted around, completely unnaturally, following our truck with those dead, hollow eyes. My dad kept driving, faster now, not saying a word. I didn't know what to say either. The silence in the cab was suffocating. The only sound was the engine and the wind howling outside. I kept expecting him to say something, to explain what we'd just seen, but he didn't. He just drove. We must have gone another half-mile when I heard it. A scream. It came from deep in the woods, off to the left, and it sounded human, but not quite. It was this guttural, pained wail, like someone or something was in agony. I whipped my head toward the sound, but all I saw were trees, their branches swaying in the wind. My dad heard it too. His eyes darted to the rearview mirror, but he kept driving, his jaw clenched tight. "Dad, what was that?" I asked, my voice shaky. "I don't know," he muttered, his eyes fixed on the road ahead. "I don't know, and I don't care to find out." He didn't stop, didn't slow down. He just kept driving, like if we could put enough distance between us and whatever was out there, we'd be safe. But I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. I kept glancing out the windows, half expecting to see that deer, or something else, lurking in the shadows. By the time we got to our usual spot for collecting firewood, the sun had fully set and darkness had swallowed the forest. My dad pulled the truck to a stop and turned off the engine. For a moment, neither of us moved. The only sound was the ticking of the cooling engine and the wind, which had picked up even more, howling through the trees like some kind of warning. "You okay?" he finally asked, glancing over at me. I nodded, but I didn't feel okay. My heart was still pounding, and my hands were cold and clammy. I didn't want to get out of the truck. I didn't want to be out here anymore, but I didn't want to seem like a scared little kid either. "We're just going to grab a few logs and head back, all right?" "In and out," he said, his voice firm, but there was an edge to it. He wasn't comfortable either. I could tell. We got out of the truck, and the cold hit me like a punch to the chest. I pulled my jacket tighter around me and followed my dad into the woods. Normally we'd split up to cover more ground, but this time we stayed close. The flashlight beams cut through the darkness, bouncing off the trees and creating these long, twisted shadows that made everything feel even more surreal. I kept glancing over my shoulder, my ears straining to hear something, anything, but all I could hear was the wind. My dad was quiet too, more focused than usual, and he moved quicker, like he was in a hurry to get this over with. After what felt like hours but was probably only 10 or 15 minutes, we had enough wood piled in the back of the truck, and my dad slammed the tailgate shut. "Let's go," he said, his voice low, almost a whisper. We climbed back into the truck, and my dad wasted no time turning it around and heading back toward the main road. As we drove, I kept my eyes on the woods outside, half expecting to see something moving between the trees. But it wasn't until we got closer to town that I started to relax. We didn't talk much on the way back. My dad was quiet, and I was too busy trying to process what had happened. When we finally pulled into the driveway, my dad turned off the engine and sat there for a moment, his hands still gripping the steering wheel. "Listen," he said, finally breaking the silence. "We're not coming back to that spot again, not ever." I looked at him, surprised. "Why?" He glanced over at me, his eyes dark and serious. Some places aren't meant for us. Do you understand?" I didn't, not really, but I nodded anyway. We never talked about it again after that night, and true to his word, we never went back to that part of the woods. I don't know what we saw or what we heard, but whatever it was, my dad wanted no part of it.